Welcome back to Talk the Walk with me. I'm Raymond Yang. For those of you who've just joined us, we have Professor John Burns from the University of Hong Kong's Department of Politics and Public Administration. Professor, can I move on from the previous topic a little bit and on to the new government led by John Lee? Do you have any first impressions of this John Lee administration? We've now seen this new government work for like 5 or 6 weeks. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's a bit early. Exactly. We've seen them for 6 weeks only. And there's been some government reorganization. It is true. And we are looking for evidence that they are solving the problems that people care about. And I'm still waiting, I have to say. There was no honeymoon period with this government, as we understand. And the reason for that is overwhelmingly the people who are in the government now were in the last government in similar positions. So it is a continuation of the Carrie Lam government in terms of personnel. Very few new faces. The problems that the Carrie Lam government was working on are the problems that the John Lee government is working on. They're the same problems. So we have to see whether a little bit of reorganization and a kick from the central government, which is what we had with Xi Jinping's visit, is going to motivate the same government to solve the problems that we care about.
You used the word continuation from the Carrie Lam government. And can I ask you if I'm correct in saying there's this general impression that John Lee is inheriting a lot of Carrie Lam's policies, because John Lee, as we all know, used to be under the flank of Carrie Lam as government number 2, and now he's taking over and carrying a lot of those policies with him into his administration. So is this a very safe way to do, being at the very early stages of his chief executive in office?
I think it's true. I mean, the problems are the same and the people are the same. So what we need is different solutions, thinking outside the box kind of solutions. And some very critical problems that Hong Kong has had for quite a while, neither the Carrie Lam nor John Lee government seem to recognize the need to address. And these problems include our colonial legacy when it comes to, for example, our system of public finance. This system carries on with a low taxation system and a system that gets revenue mainly from land and that incentivizes high land prices and things like that. We have to see the extent to which land and housing become more affordable in Hong Kong under John Lee. That's one of the issues Carrie Lam was supposed to be working on and made no progress on. So we'll have to see whether John Lee can do it too. There are other issues too, such as security and dealing with the problem of inequality among the people. And then there is the relatively new policy of more integration with the Greater Bay Area.
I think Carrie Lam would have disagreed with you after what you've said, because in her final weeks as chief executive, she said that during her tenure, the housing prices remained relatively stable compared to the tenures by her predecessors like Mr. Leung Chun-ying or Donald Tsang or even Tung Chee-hwa. And Carrie Lam said that during my tenure, I've managed to keep housing prices relatively stable. What do you think of that statement?
That's not the issue. I think the issue is, what about the waiting list to get into public housing? That is at an all-time historic high. What about the number of people living in subdivided flats? What about the number of people living in caged homes? What about the lack of transition housing? In none of these areas did she make any headway. So Yes, of course, leaders always like to say that they did very well, especially as they're leaving. But we, the people of Hong Kong, need to look at the progress critically, I think, and not simply accept government propaganda.
You said the new government needs these out-of-the-box solutions to tackle like very long-standing problems. And one of the things that John Lee actually did was to create many of these steering committees and working groups to tackle different issues. And then he actually he appoints a lot of these experts into those groups. And I assume those experts have to report to him regularly on the progress of certain issues. Is this one of the out-of-the-box solutions, or is this nothing new?
Nothing new. I mean, so yes, exactly. He has done this for COVID. The government said on July 28th that John Lee said that he had set up 13 task forces or task groups to deal with different aspects of COVID. Yet from then until today, okay, it's only 2 weeks, I can find very little evidence of any activity of these task forces, apart from one of them, the labor and welfare led task force dealing with elderly homes and COVID. So what are the others doing? I have absolutely no idea, no information, no press conferences on this, no evidence of meetings, not even evidence of terms of reference or who are the leaders or who are the members. None of this seems to be available. We heard about some reorganization for housing, yes, and task force on land and another group steering committee that's on housing policy, and these are working, and there is evidence that they of activity. But for the 13 COVID task forces, I regret to say I've been able to find almost nothing.
And John Lee also used this term KPIs during his election manifesto, saying that the government ministers and the whole civil service needs to meet these performance indicators in order to be deemed as qualified to have done their jobs. What about that KPI kind of concept? Is this going to change the way that the civil service is being seen as somehow, sometimes inefficient?
Well, the government has had performance pledges before. So these KPIs have got to be different from performance pledges. Performance pledges basically were set by the government, set at a very low level, and mostly they had 90 some percent achievement rate. The people have their own KPIs, and these KPIs, these are people's KPIs, and these are what the people expect the government to do. And in the housing area, they're the sort of the KPIs that I just talked about. That is to say, the waiting list for public housing, the number of people in subdivided flats and caged homes, these kinds of things. So we have to see those are the real KPIs that matter. And if John Lee prefers to use the word KPI, let's call them KPIs, but don't invent some low bar activity, because we, outside of government, we have our own KPIs, and whatever the government says, we will be using those to evaluate what they do.
Professor, we just have not much time left. Can I just move on to the final topic of national security? So when John Lee was elected, many say, like even the foreign media is saying, we are installing a police chief to become Hong Kong's next leader. And there was a lot of talk surrounding this notion of Hong Kong turning into a police state with John Lee being the chief executive. Do you agree to that notion, or is this an over-exaggeration?
It is an exaggeration. It is very significant that John Lee is, as a police officer, is leading the government. And not only John Lee, many from the discipline services and from the police have been installed in government. And this does make security national security the number one issue in Hong Kong. I agree with that. And so I think it is a very significant move. It is an untraditional move, and it makes the police officers who are running Hong Kong, I think, much more dependent on the central government than previous governments were when they were led by business tycoons or business professionals or administrative officers. Much more dependent on the central government. I think this is by design. These people are proved their loyalty in the 2019 anti-government protests, and so the central government is more confident of them leading Hong Kong, at least now. Security is very important. I would not call Hong Kong, though, a police state. We still have a relatively institutionalized and independent judicial system, for example, and it is still possible for the state to lose cases in the courts. And so these are the kinds of characteristics that I would look for to hope to see continue. But we are not at the stage of a police state.
Thank you, Professor Burns, for chatting with us today. And that's all for this week's Talk to Walk. See you same time next week.